So let's take a look at unit testing, and we've got our development server as part of our project, and this is an express server, and that means that we can add in our own routes. And so I've added in this get route kind of get greeting, and whenever anyone sends a get request to greeting, it's going to send back a JSON greetings from the dev server. It sets the content type to application JSON. Now I'm actually going to break this so that it errors and gives this server error. Setting the status to 500. I'm just going to save that, but you'll see why later. Then on the client, I've got my API. So in my kind of root of my source folder, I've created this API. This is just calling my REST endpoint on the dev server. I'd recommend using fetch to get your data. Fetch is the new kind of ES 2015 equivalent of Ajax. It uses promises, so it's a bit easier to use. And so you can see I've got this fetch greeting, and there's kind of two possibilities of things that can happen. If the status is greater than 400, if there's an error, then it's going to throw an error, bad response from server, and otherwise it's going to resolve the promise by returning the JSON. So let's take a look at app.js, and app.js is a React component, and it's our only component in this application. It takes in getGreeting from our API as a property, and the reason we don't import this is so that we can stub it out in test by just bringing in a promise. And the kind of main handler here is onSubmit. OnSubmit is going to prevent the default, and then it's going to set the greeting to be loading. And so you can see in our render method, we're just displaying the greeting down here. We've got a button, we've got a form, we've got onSubmit. The reason I tend to use onSubmit more than onClick is that it allows you to submit forms by pressing enter as well, which is often what you want to do for searches and things like that. So I tend to use that quite a bit, but you need to prevent the default, otherwise submit will try to refresh the page. And so we've got this kind of set state loading, and this will probably be so fast that we don't even see it happening. And then we're going to call our this.props getGreeting, and that will either succeed or fail. If it succeeds, it's going to set the state to the data that's returned from getGreeting. And if there's an error, if that promise doesn't resolve or an error is triggered inside it, it's going to catch that error and it's going to display the error message as the greeting. So let's give that a run. So I'm going to do npm start. And I'm going to come over here and I'm going to press get greeting, and I get bad response from server. And if you remember, that's because we, back in our dev server, set the response to be 500. So I'm going to comment that out and hit save. And I'm going to restart the dev server. Then if I do get greeting again, then I get the message back, greetings from dev server. So let's take a look at our unit tests, and I'm in API test.js, and this is in the __ test folder level with my API.js. And so I kind of nest my test folders, so the test folders are always at the same level as the thing that they're testing. So I'm going to import isomorphic fetch and that kind of polyfills fetch into the node environment. And then I import fetch mock, which allows me to mock out the API. And so in my first test, this is testing the happy path, and I just want to say it should return a greeting. And so I set up my mock API here, so with a match a greeting. So when somebody calls greeting, it's going to send back a response with the status 200, which is okay, and the body greeting hello, and we're going to use the method get for that. And this is an asynchronous test. And so this means that I've actually set the test to be a serial test, because by default, Arva is going to try and run tests in parallel. And then we've got this kind of async await functionality. And what async await does, it alerts JavaScript that this function can be paused. And so when it hits the await, it's going to pause until getGreeting resolves. And then it's going to set the resolve value of getGreeting to response or res, and then I can do a deep equal on the response. So I'm just expecting the response to be greetings, hello. And then I've got this second test here, and this is for the error case. This actually doesn't need to be async here, so I'm going to delete that, but it is a serial test again. And we use fetch mock to mock out greeting. This time we're going to respond with a 404 to our get, which is an error. And if we look back in our API, you can see that if the response status is over 400, then it's going to send back the message bad response from server. And so I go back into my API tests, and you can see that I'm testing to see if this is going to throw an error, and that error is going to have the message bad response from server. Now let's have a go at running these tests. So I'm going to actually make it so it only runs these tests. I can do that by adding only on here. And so this will only run these 2 tests. And so I'm going to save that. And then I can do npm run test. And this is going to run the tests once. And it says they've both passed. Another thing I can do is npm run test cover. And that is going to show me my coverage. And so here you can see that it's saying my API.js is covered 100%, but my app.js is not covered at all. I can also do npm run open coverage. And this is going to open up a coverage report. So let's have a look at this. So it shows us that in our source folder, our API.js is covered with, so this line is covered by 2 tests, which is our success and failure, as it's this if statement. These 2 clauses are each covered by 1 test. And then if we go back up, we can see our component. And if we click on app.js, then the red lines indicate parts of our code which are not covered by tests. So you can see the onSubmit being clicked is not being handled, the render is not being tested, and the constructor is not being tested. So let's go and add some tests to these areas. To test our React components, we're going to use a framework called Enzyme. And Enzyme is becoming the kind of recommended practice by the React core team for testing React. You can find a quick guide here in this Medium article. I found this video quite helpful. Now, Enzyme has a jQuery-like API which allows you to use things like find and to get DOM elements and then to simulate clicks, or to get hold of the state of your component and run tests on that. So it's really helpful for testing React. I found this guide here quite helpful for an introduction, and also this for using Enzyme with JS-DOM. Now, JS-DOM gives you a kind of browser environment that you can use from Node.js, so it allows you to simulate doing clicks and all these kind of asynchronous things that might happen inside of your component. So let's go back to our component, and I'll just show you some of the setup stuff I've done here. So this is kind of setting up JS-DOM. I've taken my null compiler, which I actually use for kind of image loading and things normally, just so that tests don't fail when they see imports for CSS and PNG, which are used with Webpack's loaders. And here I'm adding into the global scope kind of document and window and navigator and a page that my tests can use. So I'm going to go into my app tests, and let's see them. Okay, and so I'm importing Ava, React, and from Enzyme shallow render. And shallow rendering means kind of rendering a component without rendering its children, which can be really helpful for tests. And of course, I'm bringing in my app as well. So I've created a function, some kind of helper functions here. One for just kind of adding a delay because some of our tests are asynchronous and things are going to happen in the kind of the next tick. And then I've got a mocking kind of promise. So this function get greeting success returns a promise which is going to resolve with greeting hello, and this one get greeting error is going to throw an error with an error message. And what's quite nice here is that I've not had to import fetch and do all my kind of fetch mocking, and that's because I said earlier that we're taking in our get greeting as a property. So let's start with some simple tests. The first one is let's just try and test that the text of our button is get greeting. And so I create a wrapper, const wrapper, and then I shallow render my app. And I want to test that the button has this text get greeting. And then I want to test that to begin with, the state is an empty string and it's rendering out an empty string. So I get hold of the h1 and test that the text is an empty string. And these tests here are not serial because there's no asynchronous functionality. And now I'm going to start trying to submit my form. And so I'm going to have my app, I'm going to pass in my get greeting success handler. Then in my document, I do a find for the form, I simulate the submit, and I need to mock out the prevent default. And so I just pass an empty function in as prevent default. And then I'm going to test that the h1 now shows loading. So next I'm going to test the happy path. And again, I shallow render out my application and use the get greeting success. I find the form, I simulate the click, I prevent the default, and then I'm doing await delay. And delay is taking in a function and it's running it basically in the next tick of the event loop. And in the next tick, it's going to get the state of my wrapper, so I can get hold of the state directly. And I want to test that the state of the greeting is hello, and then I'm calling wrapper update. Now, if something kind of asynchronous updates or causes a re-render of your component, then you may need to call wrapper.update, which will cause a re-rendering. And then I look inside my h1 and check that the text has been set to hello, which is what is being generated by the get greeting function. So the next case is our error case, and that's pretty much the same as our happy path. So before we run these tests, I want to show you our package.json. We can look at the testing commands that we have here. So we've got our test command, which runs our test once. We've got test watch, which is going to run our tests continuously. And every time we save either our tests or we save our code, it's going to rerun our tests and show us the error. It's really useful when you're developing, just to have that running in the console. And it's quite intelligent. It will only run the tests where something has changed that affect those tests, which is quite cool. Then we've got test cover that you've seen, and we've got open coverage, which opens that coverage. And I want to show you this one, which is check coverage. Now, check coverage allows us to have a command that either kind of passes or fails depending on the amount of coverage in our code. So if I change this to 75% of statements needing to be covered, then this command will basically error if less than 75% of our statements are covered by tests. And then we can use this in things like our Git hooks, so that every time we run a commit, it will first of all run our test.cover command, and then it will check coverage. And check coverage will generate an error if less than 75% of our code is covered by tests. And then it will stop us from committing. Let's give that a go. So this failed, and the reason it failed is that if you remember, we left these test only these two lines of API.js there, and so you can see that our coverage is only 35% total, so we're not meeting that threshold of 75%. So let's go and delete those only lines, and then try and rerun our commit. And this time it passed and it successfully made our commit. And then we can go and view our coverage report, and I'll reload that, and we can see that now all of these lines are covered. This one by 5 different tests, this one by 5 tests, this one by 3, and this one by 1. And we could also use check coverage in our continuous integration script, and that could stop our app from being released if it doesn't have enough test coverage. Finally, I want to give a quick demonstration of npm run test watch. And this kind of sets a watcher mode for our tests running. So first of all, it's going to run all of our tests. You can see it ran 7 tests there. And then I'm going to change one of my tests to make it fail. So I'm just going to change this string here, and I hit save. And this causes my test to rerun. And you can see that I get an error here, and it tells me kind of what it was expecting. And so then I'm going to set that back to what it should be and hit save. And you can see that this time it only reran 5 tests, which is the 5 tests in this file, and all the tests passed.